The sun beat down on the dusty streets of Gaborone, reflecting the heat of Kago's ambition. At 21, Kago was a mathematical prodigy, clutching an acceptance letter from a prestigious engineering program. Beside him sat Lerato, the girl who had owned his heart since their days in Labatse. Her eyes, however, were filled with tears rather than joy. She had been accepted into a nursing college in South Africa, but her family's cattle post had been ravaged by drought, leaving them penniless. Kago looked at his own savings, the result of years of back-breaking labor at his uncle's construction firm and tireless tutoring. It was exactly enough for 1 degree. Without a second thought, he handed the envelope of cash to Lerato. "Your dream is my dream," he whispered, ignoring the cold pit forming in his stomach. He watched her board the bus to Mafeking, promising to wait for her return. To fund her remaining semesters, Kago took a job as a night security guard at a high-end diamond cutting facility. He spent his nights reading her old textbooks by flashlight, his brilliant mind stagnating in the silence of the corridors. He ate nothing but maize meal and water, sending every pula across the border. He was the invisible architect of her future, convinced that their shared life would be his ultimate reward. He didn't mind the calloused hands or the tired eyes, as long as her weekly calls remained sweet and full of "I love you." 4 years passed like a slow-moving shadows across the Kalahari. Kago had aged prematurely. The spark in his eyes had been replaced by a weary stoicism. Lerato was graduating. He had planned to surprise her, scraping together enough for a bus ticket and a modest silver ring. He arrived at the ceremony in Mafeking, standing at the back of the humid hall, his heart swelling with pride as her name was called. Lerato Molefe, with honors. But as the ceremony ended, Kago didn't see the grateful woman he expected. Instead, he saw Lerato draped in expensive silk, laughing with a group of affluent students. When he approached her, his worn clothes stood out like a stain against the academic finery. She looked at him not with love, but with a chilling, calculated embarrassment. "Kago, what are you doing here?" she hissed, pulling him into a secluded corner of the campus gardens. The shock came quickly. She didn't hug him. She didn't thank him. Instead, she handed him a small, sealed envelope. "I've started a new life, Kago. A nurse needs a doctor, not a security guard from the location. This is for your troubles over the years." Inside was a check that barely covered half of what he had spent on her. Before he could speak, a tall man in a lab coat approached her, wrapping an arm around her waist. Lerato introduced him as her fiancé, Dr. Sithole. Kago stood frozen, the check fluttering in the wind. The bus ride back to Gaborone was a blur of heartbreak and burning humiliation. Kago didn't cry. The betrayal was too deep for tears. He realized then that Lerato hadn't just used his money, she had used his intellect. He had spent those 4 years writing her research papers, solving her complex clinical case studies via email, and essentially earning her degree for her while she socialized. She had climbed to the top on his broken back and kicked him away once she reached the summit. Returning to his cramped room in Phase 2, Kago looked at the check. He didn't tear it up. That would be emotional and useless. Instead, he sat at his small wooden desk and opened his laptop. He wasn't the same boy who had naively given away his future. The scandal wasn't just her infidelity. It was the sheer audacity of her theft of his life. He began to dig into Lerato's new life in Johannesburg. He discovered that Lerato hadn't just found a doctor, she had found the son of a wealthy hospital mogul. Their engagement was the talk of the elite social circles. She had reinvented herself as a wealthy heiress from a prominent Botswana family, hiding her humble roots and the man who paid for her shoes.
Kago smiled, a cold, sharp expression. He realized he still had the logins to her university portal and her private cloud storage, gateways to every lie she had ever told to get ahead. Kago realized that if he couldn't be an engineer of bridges, he would be an engineer of consequences. He returned to his job at the diamond facility, but this time he wasn't just watching the doors. He used his brilliant mind to analyze the security software, finding a legal loophole in the company's scholarship program for staff. He realized that the company offered a massive innovation grant for anyone who could optimize their cutting algorithms. For 6 months, Kago lived on 2 hours of sleep. By day, he worked on a mathematical formula that would revolutionize diamond clarity mapping. By night, he monitored Lorato's digital life. He watched her plan a wedding that cost more than he had earned in a decade. She was posting photos of designer dresses and imported champagne, all while her mother back in Labatse was still struggling to buy paraffin for her stove. The shocking part of Lorato's behavior grew deeper. Kago found evidence that she had falsified her nursing practical hours she spent vacationing in Cape Town while Kago thought she was in surgery rotations. She was a fraud in every sense of the word. Kago submitted his algorithm to the board of directors anonymously at first. When the results came back, the efficiency of the plant increased by 40%. The board was desperate to find the genius behind the code. Kago finally stepped forward, not as a beggar, but as a titan.
The Diamond Company didn't just give Kago a scholarship. They gave him a seat at the executive table and a retroactive consulting fee that amounted to millions of pula. Within weeks, the security guard was the most sought-after data scientist in Botswana. He moved into a penthouse in the eye towers, overlooking the city that had once ignored him. But his goal wasn't just wealth. It was the completion of the sacrifice he had started years ago. He contacted Lerato's fiancé, Dr. Sithole, under the guise of a potential donor for the doctor's new private clinic. He invited the couple to an exclusive gala in Gaborone, celebrating the new faces of Botswana excellence. Lerato, ever the social climber, jumped at the chance to flaunt her new status in her home country. She had no idea who the host was. She assumed the K. Marathi on the invitation was some elderly tycoon she could charm. The night of the gala arrived. The ballroom was a sea of glittering jewels and expensive perfumes. Lerato entered, looking radiant in a white gown that mimicked a wedding dress. She was regaling a group of guests with stories of her prestigious upbringing and her grueling medical training. Dr. Sithole stood by her, beaming with pride at her brilliant, sophisticated bride-to-be. Then the music stopped. The master of ceremonies announced the guest of honor, the man who had revolutionized the diamond industry and the evening's primary benefactor. Kago stepped onto the stage, dressed in a bespoke charcoal suit that cost more than Lerato's entire nursing tuition. The room fell silent. Lerato's glass of Moet hit the marble floor with a shattering crack. Her face turned a sickly shade of gray. Dr. Sithole looked confused, glancing between his trembling fiancé and the confident, powerful man at the microphone. Kago didn't look at her with anger. He looked at her with the pity one reserves for a broken toy. "Ladies and gentlemen," Kago began, his voice calm and resonant, "success is often built on the foundations laid by others. I stand here because I invested in a vision. Many years ago, I funded a project that I believed would bring healing to our people." He paused, locking eyes with Lerato. "I invested every cent I had into a young woman's education. I even wrote the very papers that allowed her to graduate with honors, as she was too busy traveling." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Lerato tried to speak, but no sound came out. Kago continued, "But as any good businessman knows, you must audit your investments.
When I discovered that my project was built on academic fraud and a web of lies told to a noble doctor, I realized the investment was toxic. He then gestured to the large screen behind him. It didn't show his diamond algorithms. It showed a side-by-side comparison of Lorato's forged practical hours and her Instagram photos from the same dates. The juicy details were laid bare for all of Gaborone elite to see. Kago displayed the logs of the emails where he had sent her the answers to her final exams. He showed the bank transfers he had made from his meager security guard salary while she was checking into five-star hotels with other men. The scandal wasn't just a cheating, it was the sheer sociopathic exploitation of a man's soul. Dr. Sithole backed away from Lorato as if she were a venomous snake. "You're a liar," Sithole whispered, loud enough for the front row to hear. "You told me your father was a cattle baron. You told me you worked triple shifts at the hospital." The guests began to pull out their phones, the story hitting social media in real time. The nurse of the year was being unmasked as a fraud. Lorato screamed at Kago, a desperate, ugly sound. "You ruined me! You were supposed to be nothing! You were just a ladder!" Kago simply adjusted his cufflinks. "I didn't ruin you, Lorato. I simply stopped holding you up. You fell all on your own." Security moved in to escort the hysterical woman out of the ballroom. As she was dragged away, the final blow landed. The University of the Northwest had already been alerted to the academic fraud. Her degree was being rescinded. She wasn't a nurse, she wasn't an heiress, and she no longer had a fiancé. She was exactly what she had feared. Nothing. The aftermath was a whirlwind. Lorato fled back to the village, unable to show her face in the city or in South Africa. She faced legal charges for practicing medicine without a valid qualification during her brief internship. Her life was a wreckage of her own making. Meanwhile, Kago became a symbol of resilience across Botswana. He used his wealth to establish the Kago Foundation, a scholarship fund specifically for brilliant students who had no one else to believe in them. Kago finally went back to school, not out of necessity, but for the love of learning. He completed his doctorate in engineering in record time. He had achieved his goal. He was no longer the man who sacrificed. He was the man who built. He sat on the balcony of his home, looking out at the Gaborone skyline. He had lost 4 years, but he had gained a kingdom of his own making. He had turned a betrayal into a blueprint for a better life. The story of the security guard genius and the fraudulent nurse became a local legend. Kago proved that while you can buy an education with someone else's money, you cannot buy the brilliance required to keep the life you stole. He had funded her education, yes, but in doing so, he had inadvertently studied the hardest lesson of all, the value of his own worth. He was finally free, wealthy, and most importantly, the sole author of his own magnificent story.